exit at the various sites that the buses go to. Buses come through each of the sites about every 20 minutes. You show your ticket to board the next vehicle that you are going. While you're riding on the buses, we always require everyone to remain seated at all times. Also, never place your arms, heads, anything way outside of the other vehicles. Also, as you're in Arlington, the United States Army, which operates this cemetery, it asks all visitors not to eat or to drink anything outside of water, unless medical reasons say otherwise. Photographs, videos, they're certainly permitted here in the cemetery. The whole thing that the 5 branches of the armed forces ask everyone not to photograph or the funeral ceremonies which take place on this day. Now, our first site is going to be the Kennedy grave sites. Here you can see the final resting place of the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. John Kennedy was elected President November 8, 1960. He served as President of the United States from the 20th of January, 1961. Right up until his death on November 22nd, 1963, he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy's gravesite here in Arlington is marked by an eternal flame. Buried with him are 2 infant children that passed away before he did, named infant daughter and his son Patrick, and also former First Lady Jacqueline Onassis, who passed away in May 1994, buried at the presidential gravesite as well. Throughout Arlington, there are 2 types of headstones that you'll see. Small white markers, those were provided free of charge. The larger markers were all purchased privately. In the area located off towards our left, this area contains the gravesite of former Supreme Court Justice Hugo L. Black. Also in this area, the grave sites of former Defense Secretary James Forrestal, former Attorney General and Secretary of State Lou Rogers, and former Veterans Affairs Secretary Jesse Brown is also buried in this area. Also, this part of Arlington contains the gravesite of former Air Force Chief of Staff and Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, General Hoyt Vandenberg. The area located to our right, this area contains the grave sites of former Supreme Court Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., William Douglas, William Brennan, Potter Stewart, Thurgood Marshall, Warren Burger, and also Harold Blackmun. Also in this area is the gravesite of Admiral Hyman Rickover. He is known as the father of the nuclear navy here in the United States. And if you continue to look on the right side of the vehicle in just a few moments, you're going to see a walk path, and you'll also see some steps. In order for you to get to the Kennedy gravesite area, when you leave this vehicle, come back towards the right, take the walk path or the steps, either one will get you on up to President Kennedy's grave here in Arlington. Take everything with you when you leave the bus. Watch your step, and also watch your heads as you exit the other vehicle. Buses pick up just up ahead by the benches. They run approximately every 20 minutes, provided there's no delays along the route for any services or ceremonies or anything like that.
This is Robert F. Kennedy's grave, but they're under construction at this time, so...
Yeah, I know, but I mean...
And you can see this much of it.
And one child that would go on to reach an adult age, that was his daughter Mary. Mary Custis was the last owner that Arlington had before it became a cemetery. It was on June 30th, 1831, when Mary Custis married Army Second Lieutenant Robert E. Lee here in Arlington. This is how Robert E. Lee would come to live at the estate. He lived here with his wife for close to 30 years until April of 1861, at which time the United States Civil War started. Robert resigned from the Army as a colonel, wound up joining Virginia's military forces. It was in early May that the state of Virginia seceded from the Union. Mary Lee left Arlington and never again lived at the estate. It was in 1863 that the law started to require each landowner to start to pay their land taxes in person. Mary Lee never paid any of the taxes on the land, which was eventually sold at an auction. The first burial took place May 13th, 1864. Years after the ending of the war, Mary's son George, he wanted to see about getting the land back. Then he wanted to see what the land was actually worth. So he had someone come out and assess the land for him. He figured rather than trying to get the land back, which already had people buried in it, he'd rather have the money for it. So he headed to the courts and eventually wound up going all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States when he won the land back. And at that time, with Americans already buried here, the government paid him the money that he was seeking. Now our next site, once again, is the Tomb of the Unknowns. The Tomb of the Unknowns is the only national site in the United States of America, which is guarded 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, by a military honor guard. Right now there are remains of 3 unknowns which are located in the tomb area. You'll see a large Colorado marble capstone. That is where the remains of the unknown from the First World War are located. In front of that on the ground you'll see some markers, and the markers represent the final resting places for the remains of the unknowns of the Second World War and also the Korean War. All the unknown remains represent all of the servicemen and women that were killed in defense of the United States, and they all have received the nation's highest military award, which is the Medal of Honor. I'll show you where to go at this next site in order for you to see the Tomb of the Unknowns. You can use your cameras, your videos, whatever you brought to take a photograph with. Now, just as we continue up this road, on the left side of the vehicle, on the slopes of the hill, you'll see some small white markers which are very close together. Each of the markers have the words "in memory of" on them. These headstones are known as memorial markers because there's no one actually buried in these areas of Arlington. They're areas for those that would lose their lives and their final remains were never recovered, or if the person is buried at sea, or if they've had their ashes scattered somewhere. It can also be remembered with a memorial marker as well. About 11 areas like this here in Arlington. In just a few moments, we'll be approaching our stop for the Tomb of the Unknowns. Changing of the guard ceremony at this time of the year takes place twice an hour, at the top and at the bottom of each of the hours. Make sure when you leave the buses that you take everything with you when you leave. Please watch your step and watch your heads as well when you exit the bus. And the buses try to run about every 20 minutes, provided there's not delayed along the route for any services or anything like that, ceremonies. Walk down the road to the right, just follow this road down till you come to the Memorial Amphitheater. At the amphitheater, make a right, head to the other side of the structure, changing of the guard will take place back there. Wait right on the right here until further notice, right at the corner. This is where the buses will be picking up until further notice to continue on to the Arlington House.
your attention, please. I am Staff Sergeant Kolosov of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, United States Army, commander of the relief, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. The ceremony that you are about to witness is the changing of the guard. In keeping with the dignity of this ceremony, it is requested that everyone remain silent and standing. Thank you. Order! Out! Over! Out! 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 Over! Out! Out! Up! Over!
That will be the Confederate War Memorial, donated by the Daughters of the Confederacy after the Spanish-American War. Surrounding her will be the final resting places of 478 Confederate soldiers that you on your left. Given the right to be buried here, though, for their time in the Spanish-American War, not the Civil War. On the right-hand side, the grave sites of many of the United States colored troops, the first group of African Americans to serve in the military during the Civil War. Just past the Confederate section on your left side now, you'll see that low-bearing stone wall. Just beyond that wall is the area known as Fort Myer. Fort Myer being the home of the men and women who serve as tomb guards, where not only do they train, but they live as well. Now their training here takes them to learning how to protect a few things, not just the tomb of the unnamed. They are responsible for every dignitary who visits this land. And every funeral that goes on here is their responsibility as well. And on top of all of that, if Washington, D.C. is ever under siege, they are the first line of defense for the capital city. To the left side, we now have Section 13, and where many of those who lost their lives during the Civil War surrounding Washington, D.C. on the battles that took place then, lie to rest. But there are those who were laid to rest here specifically for the fact that they were known as unknown soldiers. Anyone who was discovered without a Bible, a book, a love letter, or their name sewn into their uniform. That was to happen. Then they were considered as unknown soldiers. We're going to make our turn here, and just to our left now will be Section 1. One of the oldest areas found here at Arlington, and where you will find the grave site of the man responsible for turning this land into a cemetery. Choosing Arlington over 13 others, not necessarily because we needed a cemetery, because we did, but because he wanted to make sure that Robert E. Lee never lived here again. So as you look to your left side, coming into view, you will see a large white sarcophagus with writing along the side. Here it is now. That is the gravesite of General Montgomery C. Holmes, responsible for making this land a new cemetery. To our right-hand side and approaching, you are going to see in a moment an equestrian statue. It will mark the final resting place of Major General Philip Kearny, who is from New York, but raised in the state of New Jersey. Kearny's last name would start the Kearny Cross, which is today the Medal of Honor, the highest honor given in the United States military. The original Memorial Amphitheater is to our right side as well. This is where Decoration Day was born. Today, they call it Memorial Day. And for those that are going to step down and visit Arlington House, not only will you have the opportunity to go through Robert E. Lee's home, there are 2 museums here on the property, and there is also a bookstore. Remember, the best view, the only best view to see Washington, D.C. is from the front of Arlington House. The express will be through in 20 minutes. It will meet you right here at the benches to court. The only man in history to hold both jobs, and was married to the woman who planted the first cherry blossom tree back in 1912. To the right side, where the brick walkway will come into view. Follow it to the top of the hill, and there you will see the final resting place of William H. and Helen Herron Taft from Ohio. And that's the brick walkway to the right, top of the hill, the Taft gravesite. Now, once you get past the Taft gravesite, you'll see the large headstone that has 5 stars and a circle on the face. The gravesite of Omar Nelson Bradley, the last 5-star general, United States military, and leader of the forces onto the beaches of Normandy during World War II. As we get ready to go through the Schley Memorial gates here in front of us, on your right-hand side, just outside the gates, the memorial to every woman that has served this nation in the United States military, where every woman that has served will never be forgotten, as over 2 million women will eventually have the opportunity to have their names on the computerized database found here at the memorial. As we return to the circle for the visitor center, if you are headed to your private vehicles at this time, or maybe a private tour bus, you are going to go through the visitor center, out the other side, and into the
Netherlands to America in appreciation for liberating them in World War II. Buildings. That USA Today headquarters in this one of those curved buildings, and this is one of the ugliest communities in the metropolitan area because it's just high rises and concrete. It was very bad planning. But on your left you can, well, now it's obscured by the trees, but you could see the Washington Monument. There's the Marine Corps Memorial through the trees. See, we're almost there. You can see that flag flying all the time. President Kennedy, that flag has to fly all the time. That's in to honor the Marines. And what we're seeing now, the Marine Corps Memorial, is a sculpture which took about 8 years to do. It's huge. It's photographer Joe Rosenthal, at the very moment that the flag was raised on top of Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima Island, about 600 miles south of Tokyo, towards the end of the war. There were 23,000 casualties, and the Marines suffered more than 5,000 dead. So this was an amazing valor. Admiral Chester Nimitz described it as uncommon valor was a common virtue. You know, when somebody gets the Medal of Honor, the inscription is for uncommon valor. And he said that there was so much bravery taking this mountaintop and taking the island, that uncommon valor was a common virtue. And so you'll see the names of all the places where the Marines have fought from the time that they were formed. And soon there'll be Afghanistan will be added there. And you'll see that they already have the most recent places that the Marines fought in. So this flies all the time, that flag in front of us. And it really is a dramatic moment. It's almost as if you can see the photograph being taken. we're going to drop off here and then this up at the other one that's just 3/4 of the way around. See it? Phoenix to Walton, 1945 to 54. Well, I think we ought to move on if you got the photographs. So much to show you. Plexiglass windows at the American History Museum. It's taking several years to conserve and restore it. They're taking out all the dust and all the fibers that are just about falling apart. And so when it's all repaired, and it's a multi-million-dollar effort, they will hang it again in the American History Museum. But you'll see them working on it. Now that flag was flying over Fort McHenry 3 weeks after the British, this is during the War of 1812, they captured Washington for 24 hours. The president fled from the White House across the Potomac River to Virginia. I'll tell you what his wife Dolly Madison did when we get to the front of the White House. Look here on the left. The curved building is the Watergate. The Kennedy Center is this white one, right that we're passing now. And Georgetown is beyond it. And the cathedral you can see on the horizon. See the Twin Towers? Now, after they burned the White House and the Capitol, the British descended on Baltimore 3 weeks later. And if they could bludgeon Fort McHenry into submission, they figured Baltimore was theirs and Philadelphia was probably next. But even though... You know what McHenry is? Yeah, you want Constitution. Yeah. Great. So they pounded Fort McHenry with between 1,500 and 1,800 shells, each weighing over 200 pounds. Francis Scott Key got it wrong in describing them as bombs. They were described as shells by the American commander of Fort McHenry and by the captains of the British warships that were lobbing them. They were essentially round spheres of metal with gunpowder inside. And when they lit the fuse, when the fuse hit the gunpowder, then the whole thing would fragment and spread shrapnel everywhere. Between 1,500 and 1,800 of those were lobbed from the British warships on Fort McHenry. And nobody flinched, not one man ran from his post. There was a hostage on board called Francis Scott Key. He was a hostage because when the British withdrew from Washington, they had some stragglers and they were captured. And one of the stragglers escaped, and he brought the British back, and they captured one of the Americans called Dr. William Beans. He was a friend of Francis Scott Key. He asked President Madison's permission to go and seek Dr. Beans's release. So Key went onto the British ships on the Chesapeake Bay, and he pleaded for this man's release. And the British commander said, I'm going to release him, not because of anything you told me, but because I have learned how compassionate Americans were to the wounded British that were left behind after the Battle of Bladensburg, just before they captured Washington. But he said, I'm not going to release you now because you know of our plans to capture Baltimore. And so you'll have to stay on board ship until we've captured Baltimore. That's how Francis Scott Key came to be a hostage on board ship. Throughout the night, he paced the deck of his ship in the darkness, hoping the explosions would continue, because if there was silence, it might mean the fort had capitulated. But in the darkness before dawn, there was a lull in the firing. And Key didn't know whether this signaled submission by the fort or whether the British had imposed a ceasefire. But gradually, the morning mist began to clear, and once more, Key made out the Stars and Stripes still flying above Fort McHenry. So never before had the flag had such a sheen to its glory. Never before had he looked with such reverence upon the symbol of his country. So in his ecstasy, because that's what it was, sheer ecstasy, he took a letter out of his pocket, and on the back of it, he wrote down anything that tumbled through his mind while the intensity of the moment lasted, thoughts, words, phrases. 3 days later, the British withdrew, and Key was allowed to land. By now, that poem was crafted and polished, and it was set to the tune of an old English drinking song called To Anacreon in Heaven. But it wasn't really until March 3rd, 1931, that President Hoover signed it into law as the official national anthem. And that very flag that the American commander of Fort McHenry, George Armistead, had ordered it to be so large as an act of defiance to the British. He wanted them to see it. This was an act of defiance, you see, and it paid off. Because if Fort McHenry had fallen, who knows what would have happened next. So it was their gallantry that inspired this Georgetown lawyer, Francis Scott Key, to write that poem. And that's the very flag that you're going to see today. It's quite a moment when you see it there. Now what they've got in a little exhibition, you will see a silver punch bowl which was given to George Armistead after the British had withdrawn as a token of appreciation for saving Baltimore from capture. And that punch bowl is a replica of one of those British shells that they loved at Fort McHenry. They gave him a silver punch bowl. So you'll see that too. And you'll see that some of the stars are missing and the flag is frayed. This is because it was souvenir. There's the back of the White House on your left. That's the south front of the White House. That's where they have the egg rolling on Easter and all the ceremonies, Rabin meeting Arafat, and that's where the president's helicopter lands and takes off. It's called Marine One. This is unfortunately heavily fortified since 9/11. You used to be able to drive the car. There's a circular road there, and you can see people walking close to the trees around the south lawn of the White House. That's been closed since 9/11. And as we go through Washington, unfortunately you're going to see a lot of evidence of what's happened since 9/11. Look at the Jersey barriers, the concrete barriers surrounding the Washington Monument there. These are all to make sure the terrorists can't get through with trucks and explosives like they did in Oklahoma City. So, in one way, they did succeed. We lost a lot of our freedom of movement, but they haven't done anything to the spirit. I gave a speech at Massachusetts Institute of Technology recently comparing 9/11 to what happened after the British captured Washington in 1814. There are so many parallels, because the capture of Washington by the British was one of the most humiliating moments in American history. The president fled, the White House and the Capitol were burned. It was a disgrace, and it's the lowest point in American history. But look what happened 3 weeks later at Fort McHenry, one of the most exhilarating and glorious moments in American history. So out of the ashes of Washington, you had a surge of patriotism throughout the country, expressing itself at Fort McHenry. And the same thing, American history. And the same thing 9/11, you see, the flags came out. Okay, we're going to get off here, and we're going to walk about 20 yards. Remember, this shelling went on for a day and a night. September the 13th, September the 14th, 1814. The British lobbied these these bombs, 1,500 to 1,800 of them. And nobody ran from that little fort over there, Fort McHenry. If they could get through the mouth of the channel between Fort McHenry and the other side of that land, they would sail up and get Baltimore on the soft underbelly. And that stopped them, the bravery of these men. And then they turned around 3 days later, and Francis Scott Key on his ship, that's when he wrote the words to the anthem. And here it is. Fort McHenry at the time. His wife was pregnant, so he sent her to Gettysburg before the battle. And, you know, he was preparing himself for the capture of the fort. Was elected, Ronald Reagan. And his men saw the majesty of the background of the mall, and that's why it was moved over here. Now, ever since, they've been inaugurated on the West Front steps. But if you attend an inaugural, you don't see as good as we do on TV, because there's an enormous tower going right up in front of the president to hold all the cameras for the TV people and the rest of the media. And so the people who've got those VIP seats, they don't see anything. They're blocked by the tower. They see it on a widescreen, you know, the TV on a widescreen. Here we're passing by a lot of the buildings here are owned by the trade union headquarters, and there are a couple of really good hotels. You know, for the senators and the congressmen. This side of the dome of the Capitol, everything this side is the Senate wing. I'll get to talk about that when we go around to later on. So we're on the Senate side of Capitol Hill. A couple of nice hotels on our left, the Hyatt Regency and the Holiday Inn Capitol. And then there's now on your left, we're passing here the Japanese-American Memorial. This is a memorial to the Japanese-Americans who were interned in World War II. That's the newest of the monuments going up. Well, the newest one that's finished. The World War II Memorial is going up, and I'm going to show you that when we get to the Lincoln Memorial. And Union Station is in front of us now. So you can see now this statue just ahead on our right is Christopher Columbus. And then the flags of all the states are in a semicircle around here. It has suddenly become the center of the tourist industry. This is where you'll find a lot of Civil War era buildings, 2- and 3-story brick buildings on our right over there. They're very easy to identify, 2- or 3-story, normally red brick. They knocked down a lot of them in the 1980s and 1990s. And then there was an outcry of what they were doing. So now they save the facade, and everything behind it is new, but at least it looks old from the front. You see those buildings on your right. That's a typical example of all these neglected places that have been around for a long, long time. You can see some of them are boarded up. That has become very expensive property now. And ahead of us is another example of what's happened. Ahead on your right, just ahead is a white building, but beyond the trees, that's the new City Museum, which is going to open next year. That was an abandoned Carnegie Library. For decades, I mean, ever since I've been in Washington, it was closed and abandoned. And now it's going to reopen next year as the City Museum of Washington. It'll tell the story of the city of Washington. So this whole area then has become the focal point of the cultural and tourist industry now. Wasn't big enough. We were losing so many of the huge conventions that were going to other cities because it wasn't big enough to accommodate them. So, for instance, we lost the annual American Booksellers Association convention. Now they're all coming back. They've been booked up at the new convention center, which is on your right. You can just see a slice of it there. But it's so massive. And look at all this development going on your right here. So the old convention center's on your left. They're going to keep it. It'll be an addition to the new one. Is the skyline. You can see the sky. I mean, it's nothing like New York. Nothing can be higher than the Washington Monument, the Capitol. So you can see the sky. We've got a lot of wide streets, and it's small. There are only just over 500,000 people who live in the District of Columbia. In the metropolitan area, like I live in the suburbs of Washington, I live in Maryland, 20 miles away. It takes me 40 minutes to commute in. In the metropolitan area, there are 3 million people and a lot of high-tech industries here. So with all these dot-coms closing and the corporate scandals, this city has been affected in a big way. There's a lot of unemployment in that field now. They had a job fair a few weeks ago in a neighboring county. 2,000 people turned up in suits and briefcases. These are the people who've been laid off by WorldCom and other places like that. We've got a lot of Civil War generals on horses in all these circles here. This one coming up is General Scott. And there's an interesting story here. When they had the unveiling, his family were furious. They had a look and they found that the sculptor had put him on a mare, not a stallion. So they made a few additions and everybody was happy. This is the Australian Embassy in front of the bus. See the Australian Embassy here on our right. There's the Daniel Webster statue on our left. And we've got a lot of think tanks on this stretch over here. The Brookings Institution will come up on your right. And the Johns Hopkins Washington, D.C. campus of their strategic studies is going to be opposite on your left. So the Brookings coming up on your right now. And on your right, you see the headquarters of the National Trust of Historic Preservation. This building on the corner here with the flags. Washington. A lot of art galleries here and historic homes. The white building on your right, flying the flag there on the corner, that was where Calvin Coolidge was staying in 1927 when Charles Lindbergh came back from his famous flight over the Atlantic. And the White House was being fixed up at the time, so Coolidge was living here. And he came onto that balcony there with Charles Lindbergh to receive the applause of the crowds. This was a very fancy area 100 years ago. You can see by the size of the mansion where Coolidge was, and they've knocked them down, and here we have Books A Million and on the Jury's Hotel. These are standing now on places which were huge houses like that white one. Now you have a classic example coming up ahead of us on our left. There's a red brick building. You can see the Victorian style with the fish scale tiles and the mansard roof. This is left over from those days. Now these were individual homes in those days. And look at that one coming up on your left. This is the Embassy of Indonesia on your left. This is where Evelyn Walsh McLean lived as a growing up here. Her father discovered, Tom Walsh discovered gold in Colorado. And they were very nouveau riche. When she just got married, she bought the Hope Diamond, 45.5 carats. It's in the Natural History Museum now. And her mother-in-law begged her not to buy it. She said it's cursed. She bought it as a young bride, and this is what happened. She was in a car with her brother. They had an accident. He was killed. Her 9-year-old son was hit by a car. He died. Her daughter overdosed on pills. She died. Her husband, Ned, died in a mental home in Maryland, 1941, denying who he was. She died in Georgetown, 1947, a recluse. She turned away the Chief Justice who came to console her. So Harry Winston got it when he, the jeweler in New York, he got it, and then he donated it to the Smithsonian. Now, on your right here is the Cosmos Club, that huge building we just passed. That used to be Cordell Hull's mansion, and that is a private club now. They have more Nobel laureates and Pulitzer Prize winners than any other club in the country as members. I spoke there 3 times after my latest book was published. It's almost inconceivable to think of it as a private home one day, because it's one of those places with a massive ballroom. You know, I mean, this was a private home 70 years ago. But that's what happened. Many of these places we're now going to pass, these are all embassies in our left and right. The Embassy of Luxembourg on your left on the corner. This was the oldest cemetery in Washington 200 years ago. So many of these buildings now if you're passing, you've got Greece on the right with the blue and white flags. So you see all the foreign flags flying here? These were private homes. Islands coming up on your left on the corner. Do you remember there was a Chilean ambassador called Letelier, former ambassador from Chile, who was assassinated on this square? They blew up a bomb when he was in a car as it was rounding the corner on our left. This is Sheridan Circle. There's the Civil War general on a horse. See another one of those. Oscar Wilde came to Washington. He said, you really don't need any more generals on horses. So. Now you see Croatia coming up on your right. There's a statue in front of it. This one right coming up here now. With the diamond squares. Now these mansions were put up by these wealthy people who made money 100 and so years ago, and they wanted to flaunt their wealth, so that's what they built. And many of them built these as their winter homes, and then they were bought out by the embassies, and a lot of the embassies are now in here. You see Cameroon on your right. Woodrow Wilson's private house is just up on your right. Turn right on the first street, about 100 yards up. Now, if you keep a lookout on your left, we're going to pass the Japanese embassy, followed by the Indian one. Korea over there on the left. Emma Maxwell Taylor was ambassador to Saigon. I interviewed him on this one on our left for that book I did on the Vietnam POW. Now this is the, on your left is the Japanese one. Beautiful building. And then the Indian one following it. And the new Turkish one on your right. Now this is an eyesore, I think, but that's a personal opinion. And then the mosque over here, this is run by the Islamic government's diplomats in Washington. The minaret, you see, is at an angle. It's got to face Mecca. Now we're crossing Rock Creek now. This used to separate Georgetown from Washington. Until 1873, Congress made it one city. There used to be two different cities. The Clintons bought a home on our left, up at the end of this road, $2.85 million. That's the new, on your left, the new Italian embassy. Just a little slowly now. The black one on your left here is the Brazilian embassy. The ambassador's wife was Princess Diana's closest friend. Whenever she came to Washington, she'd stay with her. And now, look at the statue on your left of Winston Churchill, 1 foot forward. His mother was American. So he's got 1 foot in America and 1 foot in Britain. And this is followed by the British ambassador's residence, the red brick, and the British embassy right next to it, the Chancery. That's where they do all their work. It's not a very nice building. Churchill addressed Congress in World War II by invitation, and he said, my mother was American. If my mother had been British and my father American, I would have made it here on my own steam and not by invitation. In other words, he would have been elected. Now, this is the entrance to the vice presidents on your left, ahead of us, the official residence of the vice president. Until 1976, he lived in his own home. And then they bought this, they kicked out the chief of naval operations. He got a consolation prize of a home built in 1804 in the Navy Yard. And this became the official residence then of the vice president. You'll see, as we pass, you'll see the Victorian mansion with a grey roof. But we'll get a better view when we come back down the other side. Now, Dean just said that this was called the birdhouse when young quail lived there. You see the security around here, the fence, the electronic sensors. This is a sign of the times. It's massive. It's about as large as the White House grounds, 18 acres. And there's another entrance coming up here on our left. Now, I have another tour I designed, the homes of the presidents, where they lived in Washington before and after the White House. C-SPAN filmed out in its entirety, and I take people to Nixon's home when he was vice president. Look back now, you can see the gray mansion as we pass Derek. See? And so I take him to Nixon's house where he was as vice president in his first term. The garden's 3 feet wide, no fence around it, no hedge. It's exactly as it is today as it was then in the 1950s. And the curator of the White House took me around the White House. He was originally Nixon's one of 2 Secret Service agents guarding the vice president. He only had 2 agents in 1952. Imagine, 1953. And so today it would be unthinkable for him to live in a house like that. I mean, they're heavily guarded now, as you can see. And now we're coming, the cathedral will appear on our right. There you can see the towers. See, it's Gothic architecture. And remember, it's the 6th largest in the world. Fancy schools here on your right. Al Gore's son went here, and King Hussein sent his children here. Al Gore, rather, went here. Where he met Tipper when he was a high school senior. Here we are, folks. Remember to keep together as a group. I know everybody hates the herd mentality, but there's no other alternative when you're part of a group.
Lots of goes along
Oh, okay. Down inside. Oh, yeah, down there.
Stone on stone, there's no structural steel in the building, and it's 14th century English decorated Gothic. Why don't you sit down and listen? Yeah, I can't leave too long, but let me know when you want me to take over, because I tell them all kinds of stuff. I know, but she doesn't always tell the truth. Sounds good. Sounds good. They don't know. So anyway, I said you can get a 10-story skyscraper inside. It is all Indiana limestone. It's all stone on stone. There's no structural steel in the building, and it's 14th century English decorated Gothic. Now, what does that mean? Have any of you been to Europe? Have you seen any of the Gothic cathedrals in England? Okay, then you see some similarities. First, the vaulted ribs and the pointed arches at the ceiling. Whether you know it or not, when you walk in here, everyone does the same thing. They walk in and they go up like that. And that's what, it's that Gothic architecture. Just draws your eyes right to the heavens. Third are stained glass windows. In the Middle Ages, people couldn't read or write, and they came to churches to learn Bible stories, didn't they? What is the first thing you see when you come into this cathedral? You notice the windows? How about what else, people? What else do you notice? The cross. Up there, that cross, you know, yeah? That's called a rood beam. And we'll talk more when we get down there. You know, we prayed for North Dakota a few weeks ago. It was a state day, a special day North Dakota had requested. And so, but for every state, we pray all during the week, starting on Sunday, and pray for a different state. I don't know when we're praying for South Dakota. You do need a lot of prayers, though, don't you? For water. Is it real dry? Isn't that a shame? Okay, so we have vaulted ribs, pointed arches, stained glass. Remember the stained glass? We have about 200 stained glass windows. I'll talk about those in a moment. Outside, on both the north and the south side, are giant structures called flying buttresses. And that's the fourth primary feature of Gothic architecture. So, vaulted ribs, pointed arches, stained glass, and flying buttresses. I think it's interesting, and I'll have DJ tell you when you go down there, you notice the rood beam, too, and the crucifix up there. Now, George Washington was planning, when he planned the city of Washington, wanted included in his plans a church for national purposes. In 1893, Congress granted a charter, and planning began. The foundation stone was laid in 1907. This chapel was completed September 29th, 1990. So it hasn't been very long. The 28th of September, if you were here, would be our open house day. And we have 4,000 to 6,000 people coming. And we have medieval dancers, we have the moving band, we have carousel outside, and it's a big birthday party for us every year. And people come to climb did you see that tall central tower? You can sign up and sign that. Now, we, in this age group, we don't climb the steps. We take an elevator, don't we? I do. I know that. Okay, lastly, the Christian tradition of honoring the dead. We have about 196 people interred here, and in a few moments you'll go over and see Woodrow Wilson's tomb. He's the only president buried in the District of Columbia. Now, I told you we had about 200 stained glass windows. Turn around and look. You'll get a better view of this window when you get farther down the side. Isn't that a beautiful window? That has 10,500 chunks of glass. And the other window, I'll have DJ show you as you move down, our space window. When Apollo 11's flight went to the moon in 1969, Michael Collins was the pilot of that spaceship, and he had been a student here at St. Albans School for Boys. So they brought back that rocket and put it. And the first 3 astronauts that landed on the moon came and dedicated and gave us our piece of moon rock. So the dot in the middle of the red moon is a real true piece of moon. I want a little more enthusiasm. Lovely play of colors. This is the best time of day to look at it. Oh my. Now, everybody asks, we have at least 3 services and more a day in here. We have one service at 7:30 downstairs every morning. This is War Memorial Chapel. And so these windows have to do with our wars. Now, we're not saying how great the wars were. We're saying how great the people were during the wars. For instance, the bottom row, they're putting up the flag on Iwo Jima. And on the other side, the paratroopers are landing in Europe to free the people in Europe. Right above the paratroopers is Paul Revere. And that's, of course, in your Revolutionary days. The British are coming. So there's all kinds of different things. And right over the altar itself, you'll see on the bottom right is the Battle of Midway, and on the left is the 4 chaplains going down with their ship. You remember that one in the back in the World War II? You guys look like you're almost as old as me, but maybe not quite. Anyway, World War II, the troop ships were going to Europe, and they were being sunk by the U-boats, and there weren't enough life jackets to go around, and 4 chaplains gave up their life jackets so others could live. Now, this is where we have our service at 4:30 in the afternoon, if the choir's not singing. If the choir's singing, we're in with the choir. But if not, we're in here. It's the same service we'd have any place. It's just the fact that there's so few people that it's much easier to have it in a smaller place like this than in a great big chapel. Now, that little children's chapel is in there, and as we go up through here, you can look into it and see it. It's down to size for 6-year-olds. And it's a lovely little chapel. We do not have a congregation, therefore we don't have Sunday school or anything like that. And it's just there for private baptisms or for little children to go into now and then and so forth. This and the other, and that's how we've named these chapels. This is St. John's Chapel, our main altar, and St. Mary's Chapel will be over on the other side. So let's go see if I can done of French limestone. It's much yellower than the rest of the cathedral. The rest of the cathedral is Indiana limestone. There's a big hole out there in Indiana I'm going to look at someday. And it's where all this stone comes from. It's much whiter. But this is French limestone. It has over 100 people carved up there. They all have a name under them. They all are people that have helped us with Christianity all down through the ages. And then down below on the altar is the cross. And the cross is almost 6 feet tall because you're 1/10 of a mile from the cross to the door. 1/10 of a mile. That means that we could lay the Washington Monument down in here. That's 1/10 of a mile. That's a long way, okay?
Now, you've all got to look at this stone chair over here. That stone chair, it comes from Glastonbury Inn. It's over 1,000 years old, and it's called a cathedral. A cathedral means seat for the bishop. You have to have a bishop in order to have a cathedral. So that's where your word cathedral comes from. Seat for the bishop. We have the bishop for this diocese, for the Episcopal Church in this area. That makes us a cathedral. If he did not use this as his headquarters, we'd just be a large church. It has nothing to do with what the church looks like. It's where the bishop is that makes it the cathedral. So people like out in North and South Dakota, you might have him out in the middle of the thing, so there'd be a small church, and that would be his headquarters. That's a cathedral. That's where he is. So that's what it is. It doesn't make any difference what size it is or what it looks like. It's where the bishop is.
We have two of them.
Do you? Yeah, good. Yeah, that's great. And we have over there on one of our seats, we have the different symbols for each bishop of the whole United States. So if all the bishops came, they would sit on their little seats. So there we go. Now, we want you to turn and look. This is where our choir sits. And in the middle on the left is our organ. And it has 10,700 pipes. One of the pipes you could crawl through. Another one's as big as your little finger. So that's the difference in pipes. And right ahead of you is what we call the rood screen, R-O-O-D, and it depicts the sanctuary that we're in from the rest of the cathedral. And in the old days, we were not allowed up here. We were only allowed on the other side of the rood screen. As you can see, it's a little different now. But this was only the place that the bishop and the clergy could be, and the rest of us were not allowed in this area. Now, we're going slowly, so I'll tell you. We've been here last week. They were putting them up all over the place for our 9/11 service on Wednesday, and they were absolutely gorgeous. They had some big urns that were about as big as this, and then the flowers went way up from them on the front seat as you walked in. Oh, they were gorgeous. But this is probably for a wedding. A lot of ladies like pink and white stuff. So this might have been for a wedding even. If you all come down so they can come down the steps, that's it. Now, this is where we have our service at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning. And it's the same service we'd have out in the main part of the church, but this is a smaller place because you don't have that many at 8 o'clock. Easter Sunday, we didn't. Easter Sunday, we had the 8 o'clock and the 11 o'clock out in the main part of the church, and we had over 6,000 people here. So you never know if you're getting 150 or 6,000 or what you're having. So you all belong here, so we never know if you're coming or somebody else or whatever. Now, there are 4 ways in here to tell stories. This is all carved of wood and then painted, and it tells about Mary's life with Jesus, from the top when he was born, down to the bottom when he died on the cross, and all the little things in her life. Then you've got it carved out of wood, stone. This tells who's buried here, one of our ambassadors. Then you've got the windows. The windows tell the parables. The ones on the other side were the miracles. These are the parables. And then as you go out, you'll see the wonderful tapestries. And the tapestries are done in Belgium over 400 years ago, and they tell the story of David and Goliath, so they're very lovely too. Now, who's our leader?
Was deaf in one ear totally, and almost deaf in the other one. And suddenly, one of his colleagues got up and started making a speech, but he stood so close to the microphone, and he stood so loud, he spoke so loudly that this other congressman, the deaf one, had to stagger out of the hall of the House of Representatives, and he was dazed as he slumped onto a sofa. And then somebody else came out, the door opened, and there was another blast from this microphone. And suddenly this man realized for the first time that he could hear properly. It actually restored his hearing. It's an amazing story. I wrote a book of anecdotes of Congress, and that's one of them that I'll never forget. There was another one, Usher Burdick, I just remembered now. He was from one of the Dakotas, I forgot which. From North Dakota. He seldom got up to speak. But when he did get up one day in July, it was a rare occasion, but he stood up in July and he said what he had to say. which was very little. And then he said, while I'm up here, I'm going to wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Everybody knew that he wouldn't be speaking again until the following year, so he killed two birds with one stone. It's like George Burns, who got down to tie his shoelaces, and he said, well, while I'm down here, I wonder if there's anything else I can do. So I'm going to take you to the White House. Now, even though we will be going in front of the White House tonight to see it illuminated, I want to take you there now because you won't be able to take photographs tonight. I mean, you know, you go while the sunshine is there. Yes. And while we're there, I'll tell you a few stories. If we've got time, I'll take you into the Church of the Presidents, where every president since James Madison has worshipped at least once. It's St. John's Church in Lafayette Square, if we have time. And then I want to take you to the house where Lincoln died. By that time, they close at 5, so I'll get you there before they close. But then we're going to get caught in rush hour. There's no avoiding that. That's when we're going to head for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, because I can take you there at night, but at night time you don't see the names on the wall. And so even though it still has an impact, in my opinion, you don't get the full impact of this work of genius unless you see it in the daylight. I think there are two works of art that are really the works of geniuses in Washington. One of them is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and the other one, I think, is the interior of the Holocaust Museum. They are both so powerful in the message that they try to convey that they could only have been the works of people who are beyond the normal. That's my opinion.
Oh my God.
Yes, that is it, yeah. These are his grounds again. And if you look through the trees, you'll see the mansion. Every vice president who moves in has to have that place repaired. It's always leaking and falling apart. It's a Victorian mansion. When Margaret, what's her name, Meriwether Post, the asking price was about $4 million, but the Secret Service vetoed it because it was too exposed. It was on a corner stand. And most of the presidents who lived here before or after they, bought in a cul-de-sac, there's more security. And so it's the same with the Clintons. Their road is a dead end at the end of the road. So, and they're surrounded by embassies, so you'll always find a law enforcement vehicle in front of their house. It's much easier to guard. George Bush Sr., when he was a congressman, he also lived in a cul-de-sac. Many of them did. It just provides more security. On our left, coming up just after this hotel, was the home. It's been knocked down now, but on this site on your left was the home of Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Teddy Roosevelt's daughter. She was a very witty woman, and they called her Princess Alice. Very, very witty woman. Going into dinner one day, she took somebody by the arm, and she said, if you have nothing good to say about anybody, come sit beside me. Where are there some good shops? And this place is not known for good shops. Good restaurants, yes, not shops. This might be it. This stretch about 800 yards from here. This is Connecticut Avenue. There are places like Burberry but it's not a shopper's paradise. We have any number of restaurants of all the cuisines because we have so many people from different countries living here. Not only the diplomatic corps, but a lot of people, new immigrants from far away places, El Salvador and Ethiopia. And so there's huge communities from those countries living here. and some chicken and that, and then you put the injera, which is this floppy pita, you put it over that. It'll give you no knives and forks. You eat with your hand. And then you eat everything together with that floppy pita. So that's quite popular, very inexpensive. It's just like a Japanese. 20 years ago, there were no Japanese restaurants, yeah? Everybody knows sushi today. So this stretch over here is, this is where Gorbachev came. When Gorbachev paid his last visit to Washington as head of the Soviet Union, he came down this street. And there's a building about 2 buildings up on your right. This place was crammed with people waving at Gorby. He was very popular because of his policies of glasnost and loosening up, freedom in the Soviet Union. And suddenly he did something that had never happened before when a Soviet leader came to Washington. He stopped the car and he got out and he glad-handed, American style. And it went down so well with people here. They were all screaming to get hold of him, grab his cufflinks and things like that. And this happened, let me see where this building is. It's now Morton's Steakhouse. Okay, the Mayflower is this beige building coming up on your left. That's the Grand Old Dame of Washington, but it's now a Marriott, run by Marriott. So it's come down a peg or two. But this one over here, where the American flag is in the glass window, this is the building where Gorbachev stopped. This is one of the leading steakhouses in Washington today. This is where you would find people, a lot of names in Washington, and if you were a celebrity stargazer, well, you'd come to a place like this. Now this is K Street intersecting the road we're on. It goes left and right. K Street is the street where a lot of the very well-known and very wealthy lawyers and lobbyists have their offices. The top-notch ones, the rainmakers who bring in the big clients, this is where they have their offices, not of them on K Street. The elephants and donkeys, these are the party animals that have been up for a few months. They're going to be up for a few more months. Obviously, they're political symbols. Chicago had the cows, and they've got fish in Baltimore because of the aquarium. Here we have donkeys and elephants. And they gave them out to individual artists to decorate. Some of them have been vandalized, but eventually they're going to auction them off like they did in Chicago. I asked somebody from Chicago what they went for, and she said between $25,000 and $250,000. These are corporations who would buy them. You see, all the proceeds go to charity. And so they're really fundraisers. And here you can see a donkey on our left ahead. Where was that when I saw it just now? Was it on the left? Oh, yes, yeah, on the corner on our left ahead of us. The funniest one is at DuPont Circle. It's a donkey that's got a fringe and a dress and lipstick. And then there's another wind-up donkey, the one where you would wind it up and it would be like an energy bunny. And there's a Swiss one. It was near the cathedral, but I couldn't show it to you because it wasn't on our path. Instead of a trunk, the elephant has one of these alpine horns. And he's got a Swiss flag on him, and he's got the mountain boots. They did the same thing in Calgary. Yeah, now we're almost there. We're turning left here. This will take us to the top of Lafayette Square. We'll walk through the square to the front of the John. It's known as the Church of the Presidents because it was finished in 1816 and James Madison and everybody since had been there at least once. They have a bell in the steeple that's a British cannon captured from the War of 1812, melted down, and they ring it to summon parishioners, but also when a president dies in office, they ring it. And when Benjamin Henry Latrobe finished it, he wrote to his son, "I've just finished a church in Washington that will make some people religious who were not religious before." It's a real gem inside. But there's a wonderful story connected with it. There was a homeless man called Willie Brown Jr. He'd been swindled out of his home on Capitol Hill, and he used to hang around here, really homeless. So when George Bush the First came in one Sunday to pray, he said, "Mr. President, can you pray for me?" He said, "No. Come in with us and pray for yourself." And he did. He went in every Sunday, and he always gave $1 to the church. Some people accepted him, others didn't want to know him. He was a smelly old homeless man. He died a year ago. His body was unclaimed. They were going to bury him in a pauper's grave, and then the rector and some of the parishioners claimed his body as next of kin. They cremated him, and they gave him the greatest honor the church can give. His ashes are buried on the other side of the church, together with less than 7 dozen, right next to the church.
Herb. Herb. Somebody take a picture of us. I want a picture. Come here. You can stand up. I want a picture of us. Come on. He's going to take a picture of us.
Oh, I'm sorry.
This is Andrew Jackson behind me.
Hey, who elected you guys to get out there?
It wasn't easy.
You two want to go? Okay. Okay, sure.
The woman sitting between the two yellow signs in front of the White House, that's Connie.
Okay, why don't you come over? You know, we'll take one of
She's
you
been
guys.
there for 21 years. People come to protest for any
Okay,
reason.
you ready to go? Yep. Just hold it a little bit
They're
and
right next to the White House, and they're allowed to as long as their signs are not higher than a certain height. And she's been supporting that. She's a Spanish woman married to an Italian. Had a child, a Mexican.
Okay, I'll wait, I'll get one of mine. Hang on.
Protest at the White
Wait, I'll
House.
get one of
She
mine.
linked up with the anti-nuclear crowd in Lebanon. And she survived
Should I just take one of ours? You want to take one of us for ours? Or you just push this button down? Come here.
She only leaves there to get on her bike and go to McDonald's or to go to the shower, and then she's back again. Since 1981.
Thank you. Okay, now let's get back on. We got our pictures of Mr. Pat. Come. You get a good one?
Yeah, I don't know.
You got one of this back here?
Yeah.
Not ever since the 9/11. So it's done now. I know it.
I would have seen something. I mean, I would have liked to brought it too.
Well, we're coming back to the night, I think. Yeah. We're coming back to it again tonight. picture?
Yes. Yes.
I got a little hint from Mingle that the secretary has at work and everybody steals them.
When they go on
They have a little bird, like stuffed bird from Mingle. And when somebody goes on vacation, they steal it with them. And you take pictures of it, like by the White House, and they forgot it at the bus. And then you make up your own special, really scrapbook for the Yeah, that's good. They don't want people watching. They don't want people watching. They said don't watch us, just keep going.
From the Dakotas. If you just want to gather around here. Okay, you're all here. Okay, this is where every president except George Washington has lived. George Washington died 1799. The guards had fled. The president had escaped across the river. This remarkable woman remained in the White House so that she could save a portrait of George Washington painted by Gilbert Stuart for posterity. And she knew that the advancing army had a reputation for rape, plunder, murder, vandalism, everything else that an invading army gets up to. She insisted on staying to try and save the portrait. So at that moment, two New Yorkers came into the room, Jacob Barker and Robert de Peyster. And she said, they asked if there's anything I could do to help. So she said, save that picture if at all possible. Under no circumstances allow it to fall into the hands of the British. That's a quote from an historian who interviewed one of them shortly afterwards. So she saw that Paul Jennings, her slave, was taking too long to unscrew the giant frame from the wall. She told him to break the wood and take out the linen canvas. Now, fortunately, at that moment, French John, who was in charge of the household staff, came in, and seeing a potential for permanent damage, told Jennings to stop. With Dolly's approval and according to tradition, he cut the heavyweight English twill fabric out of its frame. It now measured 95 inches long, 59 3/4 inches wide. He gave it to Barker, who started to roll it up until the Frenchman stopped him for fear the paint would crack. The two New Yorkers then put it flat in a wagon, drove on this road in that direction through Georgetown into the countryside, where they left it with a farmer they stayed with overnight. And a few weeks later, they gave it back to Dolly, and it hangs in the East Room today. And when the British burned the White House, everything inside was destroyed. All that was left was some of the walls, and some of the walls had to be rebuilt. But that portrait is the only thing that is there today that can with certainty date before the fire. And it's all due to that woman's patriotism, that she reckoned that a portrait of such significance had to be handed down to future generations. An amazing incident. Now, when I was invited to lunch at the White House, I was taken to some rooms off limits, and then the curator said, we're going in the East Room now, I want to show you something. So he took away the rope that normally keeps you 20 feet away from that famous portrait. And then I saw the mistake of the artist. In the portrait, George Washington is standing up facing you. Next to his right leg is a table. Under the table are some books spine out. The title painted by the artist on one of the books reads, Constitution and Laws of the United States, S-A-T-E-S. The original has a spelling mistake, the copies are all correct. It's amazing. And you only see it when you get close up. There's one other story I want to tell you.